Hey guys, and welcome to the Week 10 edition of the Fantasy Points XFL Breakdown. It's the regular season finale. I'm your host, Jake Tribbey, and I've got Chris Wecht here by my side to help us break down every angle of the Week 10 XFL slate. Chris, how are you doing today, and how did your Week 9 go?
I'm doing good. Week 9 was not great. Ultimately, I had a lot of the right pieces, just none in the right, all in the right lineup. Um, Dan Williams dropping a 0. Who else was it? Brian Hill really underwhelmed. I think we'll talk about that later because, as you noted when we were messaging earlier this week, they started playing some interesting formations. But yeah, it was a little up and down. Luis Perez, he did good for me in my 2 lineups. I think I had him in, but all his stacking partners were garbage, so it didn't matter. Yeah, tough one.
Yeah, Week 9 was definitely a tough week. I did okay from an XFL DFS perspective, roughly broke even. I had 2 teams that finished in the top, near the back end of the top 20 in the $15, which I was okay with. One of those teams had Eli Rogers, which totally killed it. And then another had Lindsey. That team with Lindsey was actually looking okay early on, and then Ja'Cour Pearson's long TD bumped it from like 3rd to 17th or something like that.
Yep.
Got smoked on XFL betting though. Lost the Orlando bet by half a point. Lost my Vegas bet by half a point. So that was tough. But I did have a great time. I was at the Defenders game. That was a fantastic environment. DC, really fun city. The Rock was giving out free margaritas. Well, it wasn't the Rock himself, but it was his tequila brand. Free margaritas pregame, which was pretty cool. I also got a free Terramana tequila hat. So it was a great time.
Sounds like a great time.
No, yeah, it was a really good time. And I mean, the game environment's just awesome in DC. And before we get into this week's games, we wanted to announce that we are going to continue the XFL breakdown into the playoffs. We probably won't be covering USFL to answer that question. Maybe, for next week's playoff show, we could talk about it for 5 or 10 minutes. But we will be continuing into the playoffs for, the 2-game playoff slate, those showdown slates. And then, of course, the championship showdown slate. So right now we're planning on next Friday at 11:30 a.m. For the semifinal XFL breakdown show. But getting into this week's games, slate kicks off Saturday at noon with the Orlando Guardians at the St. Louis Battlehawks. Total here is 48, super high total. St. Louis favored by 9 points. Before we get into injuries, Chris, any bets you like here?
So I think we do kind of a macro thing we just have to discuss so that, we understand how all these games are going to work. So Houston and DC are locked into the playoffs. The Arlington and San Antonio are not locked in. I think Arlington has to lose and San Antonio has to win for them to get in.
Yep.
Seattle and St. Louis is very interesting. Basically, if both teams win, then it basically becomes whoever has more points for and points less or allowed, who has the less points allowed.
Yep.
So both Seattle and St. Louis have a lot of incentive to try to score points this week. The other ways they get in is if one of them loses and the other one wins. If they both lose, I think Seattle wins or gets in.
I think it's St. Louis.
Or is it St. Louis?
Yeah, okay. Because they'd have the better divisional record.
Right. Yes, that's right. Yeah. So when we're talking, if some of what we're talking about the St. Louis and Seattle games in particular, they need to score a lot of points to try to make sure that they can clinch a playoff spot if both teams win. So for this game, the over/under does seem very high at 48 points. We're not projecting it to be quite that high right now. I don't know if I'm going to bet the under just because of there is incentive for St. Louis to just keep putting points on the board. I don't know if I want to take any bets on this one. It's a little bit of a tricky one, and Orlando's QB situation is tough as well.
Yeah, that's kind of my perspective as well. I'm a little tempted by the under, but St. Louis is probably going to try their hardest to score as many points as possible. Even if, they're winning in a blowout, they'll probably keep their foot on the gas. And then Orlando, if you told me Quinn Dormity's getting every snap this game, I'd totally pull the trigger on Orlando +9 or even Orlando money line. But we saw him get benched last week for DeAndre Francois. So I just can't really pull the trigger on anything for this game, but if I had to, I'd probably take the under and Orlando. Injuries here, not too much to cover, thankfully. Tight end Logan Carter has been ruled out for Orlando, but Cody Latimer is off the injury report and is expected to reclaim his old role this week. On the St. Louis side, Mateo Durant is questionable with a concussion. And that's pretty much all we have in terms of injuries. So starting with the Orlando side, I mean, Chris, we already mentioned it. This quarterback situation is tough. We've seen some really awesome fantasy outings and just individual plays from Quentin Dormady. When he's on, he looks really good. The problem though is like these last few weeks, he's been responsible for what? I mean, 7-8 turnovers. Like it's just absolutely brutal when he's playing badly. My thing is though, I do think he starts this game, and I think he most likely gets he could get all the work if he plays well. Probably gets at least a quarter or two, even if he plays poorly. The benching risk is obviously very real. People are going to be really scared off of him though, and I'm pretty tempted. If you told me we're getting Dormady at 3, 4, 5%, I mean, sure, there's a chance he scores 3 DraftKings points and is benched early on, but he could be the highest scoring quarterback of the slate at 3, 4, 5%. I kind of like that in tournaments, but obviously don't want to go crazy there given the benching risk.
Yeah, I don't hate it. I wish he wasn't so expensive, 10,700. It's going to make him hard. Like he does have to have one of those really good performances, 20 DraftKings points. But at 1, 2, 3% ownership, yeah, I'll probably have, a 1 to 3 lineups, something like that out of my 20 that I usually make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's pretty reasonable. If you're making probably more than 10 teams, I would highly consider playing Dormady. Obviously, single entry cash, anything like that. I mean, probably too risky there. But for like the main $15, the $1, I like him in some of that larger field stuff. I think it's reasonable. The other question though is who do we stack him with? I mean, we saw Eli Rogers and Daniel Williams had their route shares cut down pretty drastically last week, which I thought was rather strange. I mean, I don't know. I have a hard time liking anyone here that isn't Charleston Rambo or Cody Latimer, but maybe I could be convinced on one of these wide receivers. Do you have a strong take?
Yeah, Javonta Payton reached almost 80% of the routes last week. Just don't really understand what Orlando coaching is doing, especially after Eli Rogers' big game. I know they lost, but like it wasn't Rogers' fault for sure. So yeah, Rambo is probably the favorite. Like he is due to finally catch some of these deep targets. So I feel like we say it every week, but he's probably the favorite. And then yeah, Cody Latimer. Cody's not going to get popular this week because people don't really want to play Dormady. I think you're best off just keeping it to those two, assuming you're not making tons of Dormady lineups.
Yeah, so Peyton's actually on Arlington. I think that was in
that was me. I'm looking at the wrong name.
That's a note for Arlington. But yeah, no, I mean I'm with you. I think it's just really tough after Latimer and Rambo. Yeah, sorry. Now I'm just thinking about how Javonta Payton's probably a pretty good play on the Arlington side. But we'll get to that in a bit, guys. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I feel like Eli Rogers, last week was probably they probably departed from their normal offensive rotations and personnel packages because they didn't have Latimer out there. So I think there is a decent shot that one of Rogers or Dan Williams, returns to closer to a full-time wide receiver role because they're going to run their traditional offense this week. I really don't like any of these Orlando guys as one-offs. I mean, maybe Rambo or Latimer a little bit. But I think you're really only playing these guys in Dormady lineups because Francois is just bad. I mean, I don't know if you have another take here, but he wasn't very good in college. He hasn't looked good in the XFL. I think these guys are pretty much cooked if Francois gets a good majority of these quarterback reps.
Yeah, I want to say you might, not Rodgers in one-offs. Dan Williams maybe because of these cheap, he doesn't have to do a lot. I mean, we do expect Orlando to throw a lot regardless of who's at QB.
Yeah.
But yeah, probably Rambo and Latimer is the main ones for sure.
Yeah, I'm with you there. The backfield here is pretty interesting. You look around industry wide, and it looks like Devin Darlington's going to be chalk. And I mean, logically it makes sense. Last week, huge surprise. We saw Jermaine Martin declared inactive 90 minutes before kickoff. I was actually visiting the Washington Monument with my girlfriend and my mom when that happened. So I'm like panic swapping Devin Darrington in at the Washington Monument. I was probably the first person ever to make XFL late swaps at a major United States monument. But if it's tricky because I'm not sure if Martin will be inactive again or not. I mean, last week, Devin Darrington had the second best workload in terms of the percentage of backfield weighted opportunity that he earned of the full season, of the entire season. So just awesome work for Darrington, who I think is pretty good. PFF's highest graded running back. If Martin were declared inactive again, we could obviously project Darrington for a really awesome role, with the only problem being that, of course, this is the least valuable backfield in the XFL. That said, I'm a little worried Martin could be active this week and we could go back to, I mean, Darrington's clearly the lead rusher, but, if we get like a 65-35 split or a 70-30 split here, I mean, it's really tough to like Darrington at, maybe 30% ownership. Yeah, I'm wondering if you have a take here, because I think if Martin's inactive or is active, I'll probably come in under on Darrington. If Martin's inactive, I'll probably try to match the field at around 30 or 40%.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me. If Martin is active, I'm probably just out on Darrington, assuming he's going to be too popular, and just bet like we expect them to be down. We've seen them not use Darrington when they get down big. And if Martin is inactive, I don't think I'd fully fade Darrington, but I probably still am coming a little under like if he's 40%, I could see myself being 30%, maybe even a little bit lower than that.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you can think Darrington is good, and we could anticipate him getting 80% of backfield usage, but the problem is, like, when the backfield pie is worth 12, 13, 14 DraftKings points per game, I mean, he could totally dominate usage and only score, 8, 9, 10 DraftKings points. That's kind of tough. Especially if he's going to be popular.
There is not a lot of great running back options on this slate, though. So he doesn't, like, I would be surprised if there's a popular running back that scores, 20 this week.
Yeah, I mean, outside of Darrington and Jaquez Patrick, like it's pretty thin at running back this week, which I think is why so many people are going to end up on Darrington, which I mean makes a good amount of sense to me. Yeah, you have anything else on the Orlando side before we move on here?
Nope, we can go to St. Louis.
Sweet. Yeah. So as Chris noted, St. Louis obviously has a massive incentive to score points. Both these teams win. I believe St. Louis is losing the points for, points against battle to Seattle by 19 right now. So they, obviously this is the first game. So that'll make it really easy to adjust on Jermaine Martin news, of course. But also, it makes AJ McCarron a pretty strong play, especially against an Orlando defense that has struggled against every offensive opponent and is giving up, bottom 3 in pretty much every defensive metric you could come up with in the XFL. It's a great matchup for McCarron. Yeah. What do you want to do with McCarron this week? Because I don't know. I feel like he's going to be, I like DiNucci more. I feel like McCarron, it's a pretty clear top 3 at quarterback this week. And then it gets really thin with McCarron, DiNucci, and McClendon, who we'll talk about a little later. I like McCarron the least of those 3, but obviously you're going to want a decent bit of him here in this situation. What do you think of McCarron, and who are you pairing him with?
Yeah, I definitely do want some. You made a good point. I don't know how much. She's probably my 3rd favorite of the ones you mentioned.
Yeah.
I do wonder with how much they struggled last week if they get Brian Hill more involved again, because we've seen Hill be effective in that offense. But they do need to put up points, like Jake said. 19 points is not a small number to overcome. And then if they overcome that difference, and then I think if they still lead the points allowed ranking, which they currently do, or they're only down by like 6 in that one, then it goes to like points for and points allowed for the entire league. Right now it's just division, I think. So, and I have no idea what that one is. That's a lot to figure out for this. But basically they need to score a lot. And stacking wise, I mean, Aitman's going to be very popular. I don't understand how his price did not come up really at all.
Aitman could push for 50%. I mean, he's one of the best plays of the season, led all players in targets last week, 87% route share. I mean, he was out there when they first play with the starters. they clearly really like him, and yeah, he's only 4,800. I mean, it's just ridiculously cheap. So he's one of the best plays of the season, but ownership's going to reflect that.
Yeah, and then it's really Butler and Shepard. Butler, I will probably come in under. He's not going to be super popular, but he's still going to be somewhat owned.
Mm-hmm.
He's expensive. His workload really is getting cut back with Aitman back. That being said, he can, he is, very athletic. He could take a ball to the house, off a short crossing route or something like that.
Yep.
But yeah, we just haven't seen him get near that 20% target share we saw him get in the middle of the season. Shepard, though, continues to also be a pretty focal point of the offense. He's almost at 20% the past 4 weeks. He had 1 week at 19. Everything else has been over, though. He's running all the routes. Shepard and Aitman will probably be my two favorite stacking partners for McCarron.
Yeah, I actually kind of like Hakeem Butler here just because, I mean, the production as of late hasn't been great since Aitman returned to the lineup. His target share has fallen by about 10%. Still, hovering a little bit under 20, I think 18 or 19% for the target share. So obviously not great when you're paying 10,700 for a guy. At the same time, though, I mean, I think that's going to keep his ownership around 15%. And yeah, I mean, he's got a really good ceiling. I mean, he's clearly one of the best talents in the XFL. So, getting him a lower ownership, I think is pretty nice, but it's going to be so hard to get away from Aitman in these McCarron stacks. I mean, like any sort of small field stuff, Aitman is like impossible to get off of. I was playing around with some builds, for like single entry small field. And yeah, Aitman's just, I mean, you basically have to lock him in. Could be a potential leverage opportunity there, though, for like some of the larger field tournaments. I definitely wouldn't recommend playing 0% Aitman, but, you play 25, 30%, something like that, and hope he only catches a couple passes and scores 6 or 7 DK points. You're in a pretty good spot. Probably not the route I'm going to go. I imagine I'll end up roughly matching the field. He'll probably be on about half my teams. But yeah, and I think Darius Shepard is fine too. Prohl feels kind of dead in the water right now with Aitman reemerging. And yeah, he's still kind of overpriced at 5,600. Running back, though, I mean, this is like a really interesting discussion because, Brian Hill week 8 had one of the best workloads of any running back in the XFL all season. And then week 9, we see him post a 30% snap share and only 5 carries. And it wasn't like he got hurt. I rewatched the game. There was no sign of an injury there. He's not on the injury report this week. And it wasn't like they were playing Kareem Walker over him. Kareem Walker, only 10% snap share. So a running back was only on the field for 40% of St. Louis's offensive snaps. This was a huge departure from their normal offensive tendencies. We saw a lot of, 4 wide receiver, 1 tight end packages that had Gary Jennings playing this de facto running back role where it was mostly like empty sets. And then occasionally they would motion Jennings into the backfield. They gave him a couple handoffs. Stephen Mitchell also kind of rotated into that role. I have no idea if St. Louis just said, like, we're done with our running backs and we're running this 4 wide receiver, 1 tight end package with Gary Jennings as like our hybrid running back on half our offensive plays from now on, or if that was just a weird departure for their matchup against Seattle and they intend to go back to previous usage. I mean, it's the kind of thing where, like, if this is the new offense, Brian Hill's totally dead. Like, you can't play him at 10,300. But if they go back to their week 8 tendencies, Brian Hill is probably one of the best plays of the slate at like 10 or 15% ownership. I don't know what to do here. I'm probably going to play a little bit of Brian Hill. I don't think I want to fade him completely in case they do return to that old usage. But I don't think I can live with him on more than like 15% of my teams, given the fact that, he might only get 30, 40% of snaps here. Chris, I mean, do you have a take? I'm kind of at a loss.
So bizarre. Like we've wanted to attack Seattle on the ground too. Their pass defense has been one of the better units in the league. And then, yeah, I just don't get it. I can't imagine after only putting up 12 points in probably their most important game of the season so far, that they just say, yeah, this is our new identity. I don't know why they decide to switch it. I'm definitely going to have some Brian Hill just to get, hope that they go back to it and we see that massive workload that he's had before. That being said, we do expect them to pass more, but Hill's also going to still be on the field. So I don't think it's that big of a deal. Well, yeah, that's a good point. I don't know. I'll probably have 15% sounds good, maybe even a little bit more. Like I said, I don't think running back's going to be super high scoring this week. So I
Yeah.
don't know if you can really hurt yourself. Obviously, if he scores 5 points and you spent 10,000 of your salary on him, then yeah, you're probably not winning. But I think there's some good leverage opportunity there.
Yeah, I'm with Chris. I mean, I do think there's some good leverage opportunity there. Good comment here. Hill had some key fumbles in games prior. Could be part of the decline. I think that's definitely possible. I mean, the only thing that makes me iffy on that is that they were pretty willing to play Hill after his bad fumbles. And Andy Becht and a lot of these other coaches have referenced Hill as like the heart and soul of this team. When we need 5 yards, we need this, we need that. We give the ball to Brian Hill. I still think the coaches really like Hill, and I lean towards last week being very abnormal simply because of the matchup. And obviously it doesn't make a ton of sense given they didn't put up any points running this new personnel package. I think, yeah, like given that they weren't very successful last week, decent chance, like probably more likely than not, that Hill reclaims his old role. But I mean, man, it is a really tough spot. I could see just a huge range here. So yeah, if you're playing Brian Hill, obviously our projection for Brian Hill is pretty okay right now. We have him pretty close to his old workload, but just be aware that his floor is as low as pretty much any running back in the XFL right now. It's a super dicey situation. Chris, any more notes on St. Louis before we move on here?
The only other thing I'll say is I'm probably double stacking McCarron this week because of the expected bump in passing and scoring. I think, and McCarron potentially being popular. Like if I hit on McCarron, I want to hit on some of the 2 of his receiving options as well.
Yeah, Andy. I mean, he's really easy to double stack this week because you just you can work in Aitman on like every team.
Exactly.
You can get a super unique build if you go like McCarron, Butler, and Shepard, but then you have no salary left. I can't imagine that'll be very popular. Maybe I do that on like one team. But yeah, you just work Aitman into like every team, and then you have plenty of salary to get up to either Butler or Shepard there. So I definitely like that. I think I'm going to mostly double stack McCarron this week, especially with how popular he's going to be, and the expected pass rate bump makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
All right. Our second game on Saturday. This is a Saturday 3 p.m. kickoff. We've got the DC Defenders at the San Antonio Brahmas. Total here is 42. DC favored by 3. Initially I looked at this and I thought like, oh, DC -3. This is free money. And then I was like, wait a second, they might rest their starters here. And I think that's pretty clearly reflected in the line. Obviously, must-win situation for San Antonio. I don't really like anything here. Chris, do you have any bets that stand out?
The under is interesting because like DC could literally just run the ball every single play potentially if they want, and just maybe not be as efficient on the ground as we've seen them be. But yeah, I'm not betting the spread just because of the so up in the air and with their starters.
Yeah, so I watched Reggie Barlow's post-game press conference. We really don't know, just no indication. I don't even think anyone asked, in terms of what they're going to do with their starters this upcoming week. So that makes things tricky. We do have some interesting injury news here on the DC side of things. Cornerback Michael Joseph has been ruled out. I think this is mostly precautionary so that he's ready for the playoffs, but this is a pretty big loss. He's one of the best cornerbacks in the XFL. So this DC pass defense might be a little weaker, which is a big deal because they are the worst pass defense by, yards allowed per game in the XFL. So losing Michael Joseph makes them, presumably even worse. And then very shocking news last night. Raquel Armstead and Jaquez Azard have been cut. Puka Williams is expected to fill backup running back duties, but he has 3 backfield snaps and 1 carry all season. So really hard to know what to do with that. And that sort of leads us nicely into the DC side of things. Like I said, I mean, we don't know what they're going to do with their starters here. We could see Jordan Teamu and De'Aaron King do their normal rotation at quarterback. I would be pretty surprised if that happens. I mean, DC has, they have a home playoff game secured in the semifinals. They have no reason to play their key players, especially with Teamu, playing really well as of late. I think we probably see De'Aaron King for at least a half here. Chris, is that enough for you to potentially be tempted into a De'Aaron King lineup in some of these large field tournaments? Because I think you know where I fall on this.
Maybe one. Maybe
okay.
one.
There we go. That's what I was hoping for. I think that's the first time all year you've
yes,
capitulated on my
It's
DR
not a
King
bad.
board.
It's not a bad idea.
No, yeah, I mean, so like that's the thing. If Teamu gets, one quarter and King gets three, he could get there. If King plays the full game, I mean, he's pretty easily the best quarterback play of the slate. Problem is we have no idea if that's going to happen. I would anticipate, like, my best guess is Teamu starts, plays somewhere close to a quarter, at most probably a half, and King gets the rest. But yeah, there is a chance there that King just straight up starts and plays every snap, in which case, he's awesome. He's played roughly 2 full games, 126 total snaps, and he's averaging 24.4 DraftKings points per 4 quarters. So, really strong fantasy value if he can, actually get enough playing time, but it's super high risk. Nice thing though is, I mean, you'll get him at 1 or 2% ownership on the 4-game slate. So, I'll probably make 30, 35 teams for the main $15 tournament. I'll probably have De'Aaron King on 2 or 3. At the same time, though, I mean, obviously got to be ready for a rock bottom floor performance in
Yes.
case Teamu plays a bunch. And yeah, I mean, just like the unknowns with these DC rotations make it really hard to project DC and to also figure out, how should we play DC in our fantasy lineups. One thing that I was thinking about is, if you're playing a lineup with De'Aaron King, obviously it makes sense. You probably want to get off these starting wide receivers.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote up Brandon Smith this week. He's only 3,500. Serving as their de facto wide receiver 4 right now, running about 40% of routes every week. I think 2 catches in 3 straight games. So there's a decent floor if DC does decide to kind of go off the wall and play their starters there. But if they, we imagine they probably rest Lucky Jackson in some capacity. They probably rest Chris Blair or Josh Hammond at least a little bit. That really opens up the door for a full-time role for a guy like Brandon Smith. I think I'm probably going to mostly play De'Aaron King naked, but I really don't mind, De'Aaron King plus Brandon Smith. Plus, that doesn't take up a ton of salary. If they connect for like 1 touchdown, I mean, you're in a really good spot. Chris, what do we do with these DC wide receivers? And yeah, if you're going to make a De'Aaron King team, like, how do you think it makes sense to stack them up?
Yeah, I don't think you play the starters.
Yeah,
It's so we're low pass volume offense. They don't have anything to play for. They could rest. There's just no reason to do it really. Brandon Smith is interesting. I'd be fine playing him as a one-off, whether I have King in a lineup or not, just because of how cheap he is. They cut Izzard. They don't have a lot of wide receivers. Like, they got to put somebody out there on the field. So yeah, Brandon Smith's interesting pretty much regardless. I am indifferent if you feel the need to stack him with King or not. I don't think you have to stack King. I don't think I don't think you have to do one thing or the other. Maybe Alex Ellis as another tight end, the 2,500 could get a good playing time bump. They kind of rotate the tight ends. It's hard to know who they view as like the important starter, but if I had to guess on one, he's the backup in my eyes, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it is just really tough. And yeah, that's the thing. I mean, from my count, they only have 5 active wide receivers for this weekend. So, I mean, if you assume Lucky Jackson rests and then maybe, Blair Hammond gets some rest as well, I mean, Brandon Smith pretty much locked into a full-time role. Jazz Ferguson also could push for, maybe 40 or 50% of routes. I think that could be a little interesting. I actually really like Brandon Smith as a one-off play. I don't think there will be much ownership there at all. I mean, it's hard to project him well. I feel like we're pretty aggressive on DC resting their starters right now in our projections, and he still doesn't really pop for us. So he's not going to be super highly owned, but I do think he's a pretty sharp one-off there. Running back is also like really, really tough because, I mean, at first I was like, oh, Raquel Armstead is going to be, one of the best plays of the slate. I really like him. He was priced up to 6,700, but, we were still hoping he'd get like 2/3 of the work. Obviously now not cut, not on the roster. It seems like just so unlikely. The last time Raquel Armstead was inactive, I think week 5, Abram Smith, had like a 97% snap share and handled 100% of backfield weighted opportunity. I can't see that happening again this week in a meaningless game ahead of the playoffs. I mean, I'd imagine these coaches regard Abram Smith as one of their most important players. He's been playing pretty well this year. That leaves Puka Williams as like a backup running back at 3,900, who I'm a little tempted by in tournaments, but he also hasn't played all year. I mean, one carry all season for -2 yards. I really don't know what to do here. I kind of regard Abram Smith as almost unplayable. I mean, I'd much rather take my chances on Brian Hill. At the same time, though, I mean, I don't know. Like, I wouldn't be totally surprised if Abram Smith got a big workload here. I'm just kind of at a loss. Like, it's a tough one.
I think it's in a void. Like, think of it this way: like, if Abram Smith gets hurt in this game and they just cut Raquel Armstead, do they basically kill their team? I mean, they need
Yeah.
they need a potent running attack in this team. It
Yeah.
can't. They don't want to have to rely on Teamu to do everything.
Mhm.
I just don't. I don't know who they're going to play. I guess it's Puka Williams, but I don't see how you give Abram Smith a significant workload to pay off his $10,000 salary in this game.
Yeah, it is. It is really tough. I mean, we saw that week Armstead was inactive. They had Raymond Calais on the roster, who's now in the USFL. Calais played like one snap, I think. And then they were also working in quarterback 3, Eric Dungy, apparently during running back positional drills pregame. They have a new, Dungy's on IR. They have a new QB3 who I think isn't even in the player pool. I mean, they love these athletic quarterbacks. Maybe they just want Derek King to be to be the backup running back if something happens to Abram Smith.
But he also like is kind of important. So I don't know how.
See, that's the thing is like, these rosters are, I think, 3 or 4 spots smaller than NFL rosters on game day. So, super thin, not a ton of depth. And, DC, for being as run heavy as they are, they really don't have much running back depth at all, especially now with Armstead gone. So this is really tough, but I do like Puka Williams in tournaments. Really hard to justify it in any sort of smaller field stuff, but in like the larger field tournaments, I think Puka Williams makes a lot of sense as a salary saving option at 3,900. At the same time, though, I mean, nothing DC does this week I would really surprise me. So it's tough. I do think a combo that I thought about being interesting, and there's probably some negative correlation there, but maybe not given the circumstances. Doing like Derek King plus Puka Williams plus Brandon Smith, and then you just hope the backups get like all the run.
You can have a whole offense for almost just like $3,000 more than what Ben DiNucci cost alone.
Yeah, exactly. Like the salary savings there are pretty good, and there is a chance that those guys get a ton of runs. So not my favorite combo this week, but I'll probably trot out at least a lineup or two that has something like that. Just like the DC does really well and plays their backups the whole game. But yeah, this is a really dicey situation. My general philosophy though in spots like this is I do prefer to get aggressive. Like I'd much rather have shares of guys like, King, Puka Williams, Brandon Smith. If somehow the starters do play all game, I mean, that sucks. You get cooked, but you get a huge, leverage ownership advantage if you're actually right here, because people are just going to be really scared off of these spots. I think ownership is really going to concentrate really heavily on St. Louis and Seattle pretty much across the board, because, those are the teams we know have clear incentive to try to win. So I do like getting aggressive in some of these iffy playing time spots here. Chris, any last thoughts before we move on to the San Antonio side?
Nope, we can move on.
Sweet. All right. San Antonio side of things, I mean, they are still alive for the playoffs, but I mean, man, this team, at least offensively, is pretty gross. Jack Cohn not playing well, but we know he's going to get all the run here. He's a guy that I just don't think is going to make my 4-game slate player pool. Chris, do you have any interest in playing Jack Cohn? I mean, I imagine ownership will be rock bottom because people have pretty much given up on this guy.
He was not bad last week.
Yeah. He's had like some decent games.
Yeah. I mean, what did he 10 yards per attempt last week, 7.3 over the past 2 weeks. DC is not great against the pass to begin with, and we don't expect them to play their starters really. You could play worse quarterbacks, I think, at low ownership. I don't think I'd go crazy with it because, you could play him in 1 or 2 lineups and have leverage over the field. But yeah, I think he's a little interesting. The stacking partners aren't super interesting. Fred Brown is losing playing time to Nick Holley. Nick Holley's probably the most interesting because given his salary, and he continues to see a little bit higher bump in playing time. Landon Akers is still interesting, but he's a lot more expensive. Patrick is getting tons of passing looks. You could even throw him in the lineup and it wouldn't hurt. I don't hate doing a a Cone, Patrick, Holly team where San Antonio puts up points and you could throw Brandon Smith in it or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's viable. I mean, like I said, I don't think I'm going to get to Cone, but some of these one-offs are pretty interesting here. I mean, I like Akers, I like Holly. I do think, I mean, I know that it more directly ate into Fred Brown's workload last week. I do think they view Holly. I mean, he's listed as Akers backup on the depth chart. I think they view Holly as more of a slot. So if he gets more work this week, I think that that probably hurts a guy like Akers. Um, yeah, so that that's kind of the tricky part there. At the same time, Holly only 3,900. I do think it's viable in tournaments. I wrote up TJ Vasher for like the 6th week in a row in quick hits and was basically like, look, I mean the underlying metrics are still good. The air yards are there. He probably gets a couple red zone targets, but he also probably stinks. So I don't hate Vasher. I definitely prefer him to Fred Brown. But yeah, all these wide receivers are just kind of like they're viable, but I have it's a tough click. I'll probably leave them in my player pool, but I'm not going to play more than 8% or something like that on any of these guys.
Yeah, I don't. Looking at it a little closer, I don't know. Like I'd be fine if I did really want to play Cone, just putting Patrick in the lineup, even and
Mhm.
just because of they just spread the ball around a lot. We're not super confident in any of these guys.
Yeah, I do kind of like that. Like I think you gain such an ownership advantage by just playing Cone that you probably don't even have to worry about stacking him.
Mhm.
You're just hoping that he throws a couple touchdowns, gets you to like 20 DK points, and then
Right.
some of these other quarterbacks fail. You get that at 3-4% ownership. I think that's pretty nice. Yeah, and I mean, the pairing with Patrick probably has pretty solid correlation given how just impressive the target share that this backfield is earning has been. Last week, 32 weighted opportunity points for the backfield. That was the best usage of any backfield in any game this season. I mean, the floor for both these running backs, Patrick and Hilliman, is just so high because of this target work. Obviously Patrick is probably going to be 45% owned, should be right there as the most popular running back of the slate. I don't think we have to spend a ton of time on him. I mean, his workload's really good, and he's a strong play, a really strong projected value. But Hilliman at I believe he's 3,100. I think is the guy who's a little more interesting. 3,200. He projects as a pretty strong value and seems like a close to a lock to get you like 5 or 6 DK points. I mean, the ceiling obviously isn't great, but any interest in Hilliman for this week?
Yeah, I think I'm talking myself into Cone Hillman stacks.
Oh,
So I mean, 17% target share 3 weeks ago, 11% 2 weeks ago, 20% this past week. Yeah, he's gonna catch. He's gonna get 4 or 5 targets, and he's gonna catch 3 to 4 of them, or if not all of them, because they're not going to be deep. So
yeah.
that's like just the receptions alone. He's already almost at double his salary, and then whatever yardage and carries you get on top of that is it's pretty intriguing. I think you could play Patrick and Hillman in the same lineup. I don't know if I would do that with a cone stack. That seems a little aggressive, but
Yeah.
yeah, I do think you want some exposure to not just Patrick. You definitely want some Hillman this week.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm with you. I do think Patrick and Hillman in the same lineup is definitely interesting. I wouldn't do that with Cone, but I mean, man, I think it's viable. Like if this backfield sees anywhere close to the 32 weighted opportunity points they had last week, I mean, both those guys are going to end up being pretty solid values. Only thing with Hillman is TD equity isn't nearly as good as
Yeah.
Patrick. They certainly prefer Patrick at the goal line and in the red zone, but we've seen a little bit of red zone work for Hillman, so he's not totally dust in that regard. Chris, anything more on San Antonio?
Nope, we can move on.
All right. First game of the day on Sunday. This is a Sunday 3 p.m. kickoff. It's the Houston Roughnecks at the Arlington Renegades. Total here is 42. Depends where you look, but this game is listed as a pick 'em on some of the sharpest books. Some other books have Arlington favored by a point or Houston favored by a point. Either way, the spread's very close. Chris, if we assume the game's a pick 'em, do you have any betting leans here?
I think I like the Arlington side, which
Oh,
is crazy how far we've come.
yeah. Yeah.
Uh, I don't know what Houston's going to do. I don't know. Like, if I was their coach, I would kind of say, we got to work out some of these kinks that we're having and play Silvers a decent amount, or McDonald for that matter. I mean,
Yeah.
but even then, like, they're just both been so bad when they've had time to play these past few weeks that I don't know what they can't risk losing like Burnett or Bird or Harris or Justin Smith for the playoff run. I don't know what they're going to do. I'm not expecting a lot of points in this one.
Yeah, this feels like a really gross game. I mean, the Arlington side's pretty clean, but Houston, it's tough. For what it's worth, Wade Phillips did say, if it's the last game of the year and we have everything wrapped up, we will want to play our starters some, but we don't want to take a chance on getting our top players injured.
Right.
That was in last week's post-game press conference. So it's easy to think like, oh, Deontay Burnett and Max Borghi and maybe a few of these other wide receivers get a little more rest than usual. For quarterback, though, it's really hard to know how to interpret something like that, considering Silvers hasn't played well and Cole McDonald hasn't looked great when he was, given serious reps. I really don't like any bets in this game. I think this is a pretty clear, just lay off. Injury side of things, Dejon Lee was limited on Wednesday and Thursday with a shoulder issue. He looks pretty questionable for this week. Obviously inactive the previous week. Michael Bandy, who was a surprise inactive last week, hasn't practiced this week due to a hip issue. Probably misses his second game in a row. On the Arlington side of things, Davion Smith hasn't practiced this week due to an ankle injury. I do think he plays. I mean, he toughed out the ankle injury near the end of last week, but he's clearly very questionable. Letty Brown, if Davion Smith plays, Letty Brown is an awesome play. Victor Bolden also hasn't practiced this week due to a shoulder injury. I don't think he plays. Starting with the Houston side of things, quarterback here is just really, really tough. Like we said, I mean, I think this is a clear, just totally faded spot. You could argue maybe for playing Cole McDonald if you think the team, still clearly views Brandon Silvers as like their starter. And if this guy gets hurt, like we're totally screwed. In that case, Cole McDonald probably gets at least 3/4 in this game. I don't love it, but I mean, McDonald definitely has fantasy juice as a starting quarterback, if only because he's so willing to run the ball. Chris, do you have any take on this quarterback situation?
Yeah, I'm not off it. I'm gonna let if somebody wants to play McDonald, I'm gonna bet on them not being perfect and the rest of their lineup and to be able to beat me. He's gonna be maybe 1% owned.
Yeah.
It's super thin. He wasn't good. When he started. I'd rather get up to Cone for 900 more or something. I think that's what it was.
Yeah.
I don't think you play the QBs in this game.
Yeah, it's a brutal spot. And I mean, given the safety that you can find at quarterback in some other places, and I mean, like the leverage opportunities that we have with guys like Derek King or even Quentin Dormady, or even, like Jack Cohn.
Or Luis Perez even,
Yeah. Perez, I think will, might be like 10%, but still, I mean, it's like, why bother taking on this unnecessary risk by playing? Right. I mean, Silvers, I think, is totally unplayable. McDonald, you could maybe argue for, but still pretty gross there. Wide receiver, I actually have like a somewhat strong take here. I think to me, it's pretty clear. Like Deontay Burnett is the guy leading the way in this offense. I mean, clearly the most talented receiver who's left. I think he doesn't get more than a quarter, maybe a half. And they have pretty rigid roles for these wide receivers where we see, Justin Smith and Burnett pretty much only play on the outside, and their direct backup is Tavon Salter. Salter only has 5 routes all season, but he's, I think, the minimum price. Yeah, he's 3,000. So, if Burnett sits out half the game or more, and you tell me Salter gets, 60, 70% route share, Tavon Salter's actually like a really good play, I think. Obviously, there's some risk baked in because we don't totally know what Houston is doing with their starters. But yeah, Chris, how are you viewing these Houston wide receivers, and who do you think is most likely to sit this week?
Yeah, Burnett and Smith for sure. I don't think play a ton. I don't think
you think Smith sits, because I mean, like my thing is like they need 2 outside receivers, right? So that's the only part where it gets a little dicey for me. Is I think Smith probably plays, but it's tough.
Yeah, he might play, but
The coaches really like him. I mean,
Right, yeah.
that's true.
That's the thing, yeah, and even if, like, I'd rather, okay, so he plays, even if he plays the full game, I don't think I like Smith. Like, I'd
Yeah,
rather take my shot on some of these other cheaper guys.
for sure.
Harris and Bird, they probably, one of them definitely doesn't really play. I don't really know which one they value more. I
My
think
guess is Harris.
Harris.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's Harris. I mean, Harris has looked better, like just from the eye test. Plus, he had like a 97% route share last week. Bird was down to 57%.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
just looking at route share, I mean, I do think they prefer Harris a little more there. So that opens the door for a guy like Ben Putman, right?
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, I want to say you should take shots with some of these cheap guys, but I still just project this passing offense to not be great. So I don't know what you win even when you hit.
Yeah.
Um, it's really going to come down to, do I need the Stone Min price to be able to fit other pieces in a lineup? I'm not going to force these guys in, but if they make something else fit, then I'm fine with it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd consider like Brandon Smith much more preferable of a play to a guy
Right.
like Ben Putman or Tavon Salter. At the same time, though, I mean, I don't think Putman and Salter are bad plays by any means, but I do think you make a good point. I mean, if we assume like they rest a lot of guys, maybe McDonald plays a lot. I mean, this passing offense doesn't have a ton of juice, but Putman and Salter are the minimum price, so you only need 7, 8, 9 DraftKings points for these guys to potentially win you a tournament. Another interesting note was that Garrett Owens actually, he really hadn't played all year up to this point. Played a good amount last week. 32% route share, by far his highest of the season. I'm not sure if we're going to see him more involved. He's like a running back tight end hybrid.
Mm-hmm.
Probably only in play for showdown. Like I'm definitely not touching him on the
Yeah.
4-game slate, even the 2-game slate. It's probably too thin.
I'm guessing they kind of view him as a somewhat starter, and I would expect,
Yeah.
but they also don't really have somebody else that could play the role. So
Yeah, he's a
I
guy
don't
where
know.
like if he got hurt, like they would have to like just X out some plays from
Right.
their playbook because
Right.
he is their only like tight end basically. Yeah, so definitely like a tough spot for sure. I mean, I think the only two receivers I'm like comfortable with are Putman and Salter here.
Yep.
Maybe, I mean, if Bandy was active, which again I don't think he will be, I would actually probably like Bandy a lot, but I don't. It's really tough. Like if he is active at this point, given he hasn't practiced, like I would definitely prefer Putman for the slot snaps. Yeah, I'm not
Yep.
sure any take there.
Nah, yeah, I don't know. I don't.
It's so
My
tough.
advice is just don't force these guys into a lineup.
Yeah.
But if they make another lineup fit because they're so cheap, then I'm totally fine with taking your shot on any of them.
Yeah, and the nice thing with like Putman and Salter is if you make 20 teams, I mean, you'd only need to throw those guys on one or
Right.
two to have like pretty serious leverage that no one's going to
Right.
want to touch them. I mean, it's just a very uncertain situation. Running back here, I actually do feel like there's a decent bit of surgery. Obviously, Dejon Lee's status is pretty crucial to how we project this backfield. At the same time, though, I mean, I think the team very clearly views Max Borghi as one of their key offensive players. I mean, he doesn't play a ton, right around a 50-55% snap share most weeks, but when he's on the field, I mean, he gets the ball a lot. Like his route share is crazy low, but his targets per route run is crazy high. So I think,
Mhm.
it's pretty clear how the offense views Borghi, and they think pretty highly of him, which opens the door for a guy like Bryson Aline at 4,200 to potentially, act as like the starting running back, almost bell cow maybe, for like 3/4 or something like that. It's tricky though. If Dejon Lee's active, I like Aline a lot less. I think there's a real chance him and Lee could split backfield work here. Yeah, Chris, what's your take? Because for me, I mean, if Lee's out, I actually really like Aline. I think he's a great play.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It is tough with this being the third game. Like
Yeah.
you don't have a lot of options to go to. It probably works best in the flex spot because you could pivot to one of these Houston wide receivers, or maybe whatever happens with Letty Brown and Devion Smith, maybe you can pivot to Letty Brown. Yeah, you just got to be conscious of your swap options if you are playing a lot of Aline, that making sure that you know what you can swap to, because I don't think there's going to be anything you could swap to in Vegas, Seattle at running back. You could do stuff at flex, so maybe that's the key is don't leave a lean in your RB spot a ton because it is going to be tough to swap off him if we think we need to.
Yeah, I think you're going to want to play a lean in a lot of 2 running back lineups and force him into the flex. I mean, you could another thing you could do is just always leave 700 on the table in all your lean lineups, and then if Davion Smith is ruled out, like you have a really easy pivot to Letty Brown, or worst case, Davion Smith plays, Dejon Lee plays, you can just rotate some Letty Brown in there so that you don't have like a ton of a lean exposure in case his usage isn't great. So you do have some options there, but I would just like be hyper aware when you're making lineups that you're going to want some flexibility, because if Dejon Lee is active, I mean, I think it's like best case, maybe a 65-35 split in favor of a lean, but realistically it's probably 50-50 or close to it.
Yeah. And not a lot of points scored. So that's
that's the other tricky part is like if Houston plays a lot of their backups, like I'm not anticipating a really great offensive outing here. Anything you have on Houston before we move on to Arlington?
Nope, we can go to Arlington.
All righty. So Arlington, very clear incentive to win here. I believe it's a win and in spot for Arlington. Luis Perez, very clearly the quarterback, one of the handful of guys who we know is going to play every single snap this week. I don't think he'll be super popular. I mean, I believe his 21 DraftKings points last week was a pretty solid outing for him. Granted, that was in a much better matchup against the DC pass defense. Houston pass defense significantly stronger. At the same time, though, I mean, if we get Perez 8, 9, 10%, I could get behind it. The only problem is knowing who you're going to stack him with. That I'm still a little iffy on. Chris, if you're playing Perez, who do you like to pair him with?
I don't have a good answer. I thought it was Arcanado last week. They said he's been the guy he's trained with in the offseason, and then we saw Arcanado's route share dip. So this has been the story with Arlington all season. We just really don't know, other than Sal Cannella, we don't know who they're going to trot out at receiver. Cannella, I guess, is viable. It's a little expensive. It doesn't feel awesome, but it's, he's viable. You can, he's not going to kill you. Other than that, I don't have a strong take. Peyton, maybe you could try Arcanado again. They're all cheap.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is you can mix and match these combos. I think Vaughn's, Arcanado, and Peyton are all in play. Vaughn's would probably be my favorite among those wide receivers. I mean, my favorite overall is just Cannella. He's clearly got the best target floor there and the best, floor in terms of routes run. I don't know though. It's tough. Like I'll probably only play 2 or 3 Perez teams, and I'll probably mostly have Cannella. Really tough spot. And I really don't like any of these Arlington players as one-offs.
Yeah. I don't think you have to stack him either. I think it's similar to Jack Cohn where, if you really are set on playing Perez, you don't have to force in the stack. I'm probably deciding if of these like dart throw QBs, if I want to play Perez or Cohn. I don't want to allocate too many of my lineups to these types of QBs.
Yeah.
But yeah, don't force anybody in there. Like last week, you would have been totally fine if you just played Perez and no stacking partner.
Yeah, and like the thing with Perez and Cohn is that their ceiling is probably between 20 and 24 DK points. I mean, at that score, like you're also banking on a lot of these other quarterbacks failing. In a lot of ways, I'd kind of rather go for these like much riskier, higher upside bets like Dormady or even Derek King. I will still have some Perez though. Like I don't think I'm going to fade him. Especially just because this is such a big game for Arlington. I mean, they can't risk losing this game in any capacity. Backfield here is pretty interesting. I mean, the usage last week was awesome. 29 weighted opportunity points for the backfield. I do think industry-wide that Letty Brown is maybe being a little over projected. I mean, Davion Smith, like he missed about a full quarter due to his ankle injury last week, came back in and actually looked fine. Like he looked healthy, went on the field, but like on the sideline, I mean, you can tell he was hurting pretty bad, had his ankle retaped quite a few times. My source there is myself. I was at the game. So I mean, I don't think I can really get behind Davion Smith. I mean, there's some decent leverage there. Like, I mean, 600 more and you can get to Jaquez Patrick. So for 8,200, I mean, you can definitely get some leverage on Smith. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get there. Letty Brown at 4,900 is the guy I think everyone's going to be pretty interested in. Some decent standalone value if Davion Smith plays. And if, Smith sits, I mean, Letty Brown is probably the best running back play of the week with how much this team, just feeds their running backs. Chris, what's your take here?
Yeah, that was going to be my point. You probably want to build some lineups with Letty Brown, even if you don't really like him as a play, because other than Patrick, he probably becomes the best running back play, if not better, because he's cheaper.
Yeah.
You definitely do want some exposure to Letty Brown just in case Devion Smith is inactive. And even if he's active, he's not a terrible play. He's not an awesome play though, because he's probably going to be popular. So that's not awesome. Similar with Aline, there's not really a lot of swap options because they're in that same price range. So you probably just have to roll with it. And I don't think it's going to kill you. I think he's involved enough, but you just want to take the chance that you're getting like a smash play potentially.
Yeah. I mean, one thing you could do with Letty Brown is, definitely prefer him to Aline in your initial builds. And then if Dejoun Lee is inactive and Davion Smith is active, you can just swap to a lot of Aline and leave a little bit of salary on the table. I think that's fine. I do think that if Davion Smith is active, Brown probably goes over-owned, especially since this is the third game of the slate. Man, I don't know. I kind of hate Davion Smith from like a projected points perspective. I mean, he's not a good value this week. At the same time, though, I do like, I'm kind of convincing myself that there is pretty good leverage there. I might end up on like 10% Davion Smith. It's just really tricky because the swap options are, really bad in that range.
What's like Philip Lindsay?
7.3, I want to say.
Yeah, that's probably your best option, or whatever happens with the Vegas backfield too. But then you're leaving a lot more. You can move around a decent amount. Smith is actually not hard to move around off of, I don't think.
Okay,
because of Lindsay and whatever Vegas does in their backfield. And then you can adjust, spend that salary to move up to a Seattle wide receiver or something.
Yeah, I think so. On now that we've talked about this, I think on like Davion Smith teams, even Letty Brown teams, I would try to prioritize these guys in like your Vegas, Seattle game stacks. So that way, regardless of what happens with their status, you have a lot of optionality for who you can swap to. Because if you load up on guys from these first two games and then you have one spot left and it's Davion Smith and he's inactive, I mean, you're not looking great.
Yeah,
giving up a lot of value there. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Chris, anything else on Arlington before we move on?
Nope.
Sweet. All right, guys. Our last game of the regular season. This is a Sunday 7 p.m. kickoff. It's the Vegas Vipers at the Seattle Sea Dragons. Total here is 47. Seattle is favored by 8.5. Chris, any bets you like here?
I think Vegas is being a little bit underrated, but again, this is a spot where Seattle's going to try to lay on the points, but they kind of play that way already. So I don't know if that really changes that to me. So yeah, I kind of like the Vegas with the 8.5 points here.
Yeah. So actually, I had a bet that I really liked. This was a 3-parter. So I bet Seattle to win the championship plus 500. I did all this on Bovada, and then I hedged with, some Vegas plus 8.5 and also some Vegas money line. So if Seattle just loses this game and misses the playoffs, I roughly break even. And then, Seattle wins as expected, then my true odds for betting, Seattle to win the championship are like 3-1, 3.5-1, something in that range, which would be better. I mean, I think they'd be about 2.5-1 if they, secure a playoff spot. So I really like that as sort of like an arbitrage between, Seattle's playoff chances. Can grab that on Bovada. They're still hanging plus 500 for Seattle to win the championship. I think pretty much everywhere else has like plus 400-ish. So pretty solid odds there on Seattle. But yeah, like straight up, I do prefer the Vegas side. Yeah, I think 8.5 is just a little disrespectful. I mean, we've seen the offense look pretty good with McClendon back there, and the defense is a little improved. I think not a total disaster anymore. Injuries, we've got a good bit to go through here. On the Vegas side, Martavis Bryant dealing with a neck issue and Rod Smith dealing with an ankle issue. They haven't practiced this week. Both guys, I think, probably missed this game. On the Seattle side, Damian Willis has not practiced this week. He's dealing with a hip issue. Real chance he misses week 10, which would open the door to more playing time for both Jordan VC and Josh Gordon. Chris, starting with the Vegas side here, I really like McClendon. I had him as our top quarterback play of the week. He's our top quarterback value. Granted, McCarron and DiNucci are kind of close. I think industry-wide, McClendon's like roughly tied with McCarron and DiNucci as the top quarterback value. Man, I really like him. I mean, shown great stuff with his legs, throwing pretty well, at least, well enough to not get benched. Yeah, what's your thought on McClendon, and how do you think he stacks up versus, these other two super popular quarterbacks in DiNucci and McCarron?
Yeah, I definitely like McClendon this week. He's not going to be unowned, but he's going to be, not the most popular QB. McClendon or not, DiNucci and McCarron will be more popular. Hey, I mean, last 3 games, 7.8 yards per attempt. He's using his legs. I definitely will have a good amount of McClendon this week in a game. They're going to try to play spoiler.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and if Seattle is pushing like they normally do, but even to a slightly bigger extent, Vegas is going to have to try to put up points. So, and he's cheaper. Under 10,000 for compared to some of these other QBs is a pretty low value salary QB.
Yeah. I mean, 9,200. I think his salary went down 200 after last week, which was a little confusing there. And I mean, these Vegas quarterbacks in full games are averaging about 24 DraftKings points per game. I mean, a lot of reasons to like a guy like McClendon in this spot. And I think, especially if you assume both DiNucci and McCarron push for closer to 30% ownership and McClendon's around 20%, I mean, man, that makes me like him quite a bit. Wide receiver is a little tricky with Martavis Bryant's status up in the air. I mean, a guy that I wrote up and obviously really like is Jeff Badet. He's not projecting super well, but I'm not necessarily sure if, that's a mistake or not, because this passing offense with McClendon, 224 passing yards per game. Without McClendon, 232 passing yards per game. So, there's really no drop off there with McClendon at quarterback. And it feels like, industry wide and, us too, even a little bit, we're sort of projecting Badet as not the same guy of weeks past, maybe because McClendon's at quarterback. I'm not necessarily sure that's correct. I mean, we gave him if we gave him a 14-point projection, he'd be pretty clearly one of the top plays of the slate. I mean, I bet he clocks in sub 10% for sure, maybe closer to 5. Yeah, Chris, what are your thoughts on Badet for tournaments and some of these other Vegas guys too?
Yeah, I do. I really like Badet this week. It's hard to, like you said, it's hard to project him into that role that we've seen in the past, and is high. He's still expensive, 9,900.
Yeah.
So he's not going to project well, but I think is a good idea to force him into some lineups, because what if he does get that old role? He's definitely the best receiver on the team
for sure.
And
I mean, he's so explosive too.
Right.
He might only need 3 or 4 touches to get 100 total yards.
Right. Yeah. So sub 5%, sub 10%. I'm definitely getting some Badet in my lineups, and he's probably the preferred McClendon stacking partner.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel awesome about the other guys. Allison is somewhat interesting. Sexton maybe as well as a cheap option. You could throw Sexton in as a double stack because he's that cheap if you want. Sweeting, not really interested in. Yeah, got to see what happens with Bryant, but I think Bryant being out definitely is a boost to Badet and Allison for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Allison is definitely interesting. I think on my McClendon teams, I'll probably only have Badet and Allison, and I also think you're probably only single stacking McClendon because of how much he can get done with his legs. Sexton, I certainly think is viable. Man, Sweeting is really tough because it feels like he has this outstanding TD equity. They love him in the red zone for some reason, and then they just don't want to play him anywhere else. He's had some brutal drops this year, but he's also looked pretty good with the ball in his hands. He's sort of like that wild card where I feel like if you're making a ton of teams, it definitely makes some sense to mix him in, especially on some McClendon lineups. But I mean, his floor is just so low. But yeah, Allison and Badet, probably my favorite guys there. if Martavis Bryant plays in this game, would you have any interest there? I mean, his route share's been pretty decent. They've pretty much settled when they're all healthy on, the Allison, Bryant, Badette rotation being their top three. Yeah, would you have any interest there in some large field tournaments? He'll be like 1% or probably sub 1%.
Yeah, I probably would. I wouldn't go crazy with it. He's a clear distant third from Allison and Badette in terms of route share. You're maxing out at around 12-ish% target share on average.
Yeah.
So you're just hoping for a deep bomb, which is he's not too expensive. If he is active, it's tough to say. I'll definitely build with him in. I might wait and see, and then try to work him in depending on what I can do with where my lineups are at. He's awesome as I'm down. I need something crazy to happen.
Yeah,
and he's
active. Yeah, for sure. And I'd view like kind of Sinky Sweeting as a similar play too. If Martavis Bryant can't go, I mean Sweeting. Yeah, if you're down huge and you've got a McClendon stack and you need to get off like Geronimo Allison, I mean Sinky Sweeting's probably your best bet. On the Vegas side of things, running back here, very up in the air, obviously, with Rod Smith's status being unknown. If Rod Smith plays, John Lovett goes from, right there with Jaquez Patrick as the top play of the slate to only an okay play, but still viable. But if Smith sits, I mean, Lovett is, I think I'd have him ahead of Jaquez Patrick as the top play of the slate, just given that his salary is only $5,200. We could see a rotation there. I mean, we will see a rotation in some capacity with Brian Burt. But Lovett's like a good player, and the team, clearly prefers him to Burt. Gets, really explosive player in the receiving game, fourth among all players in yards after the catch, by far first among running backs. Chris, how do you want to play John Lovett, both if Rod Smith plays and also if he sits?
Yeah, I'll definitely have Lovett whether Smith plays or not. If if Smith is out, you get even more of him. Yeah, he gets tons of receiving work pretty much no matter what. He's got a strong yard per carry on the season, 3.8, last 3 games, 4.4. Seattle's not great against the run. You can stack him with McClendon because of his receiving work if you want. He's different than some of these other backs that we've talked about where you don't have to worry too much about having to swap off of him because he's not going to be popular. Or I don't know. What do you think is?
It's really tough. So right now, industry wide, so I think we're projecting Rod Smith is just out right now. Rest of the industry has Rod Smith in. That makes it really difficult to have a good idea of what ownership is gonna be. I imagine we get some word on Lovett's status today, on Rod Smith's status today. So if that's the case, and we have clarity by Friday evening, I'd imagine Lovett's like 40%. I think running back ownership, if Rod Smith sits, is probably like Jaquez Patrick, 45 or 50%. Lovett, right around 40, and then Darrington at like 30. And then everyone else is going to be like in the 10-ish range. Maybe Brian Hill pushes for 15.
Because people aren't going to, if we get similar news that Smith's looking questionable, like the way we are with Devion Smith, people are going to prefer the Lovett over Letty Brown for sure.
Yeah. I definitely.
So I don't think he's going to be, assuming we don't hear anything like, oh, Rod Smith's definitely playing. I do think you're right. Lovett will be at least 15%, could creep even higher to 30%, depending on what the news is. I don't think that changes too much for me. I mean, I guess it makes him a little less awesome, but he's not going to get out of control. I know that. And he's cheap enough where, there's a lot of ways he can pay off and it isn't as dependent on Smith being active or not as some of these other running backs.
Yeah, and the other thing too is like I would pretty much give him, I mean, not all of the red zone role, but close to it. Brian Burt doesn't have a red zone touch this year. So yeah, and Rod Smith is generally the guy they've preferred near the goal line. So I do think that goal line role would be more in Lovett's hands this week, which would certainly be valuable for him. I mean, I think best case for his ownership is probably them ruling Rod Smith as officially questionable. That would open the door up for Lovett being a bit lower owned this week. But yeah, I mean, I think we both like him quite a bit. And I mean, like the nice thing is if Rod Smith does play and you're like, oh no, I can't swap off for whatever reason, like Lovett's not going to kill you on his own. I mean, we've seen like even games with Rod Smith active, Lovett can still push for 20 DK points. So you're not total dust if Rod Smith plays it, with Lovett priced at 5,200. Anything else on Vegas before we get to Seattle?
Nope, we can go to Seattle.
All right. So, yeah, as we've mentioned previously, I mean, Seattle obviously has a ton of incentive to both win this game and score as many points as possible. The matchup's really strong. This Vegas defense, bottom 3 in pretty much every metric. Ben DiNucci has looked really good these last few weeks. He's, cut down on his turnovers. He's running well, throwing really well. I think it's pretty obvious that, anyone who's playing XFL DFS is going to like DiNucci, going to want some DiNucci in tournaments. The real question, though, is like, who are the best guys to stack them with? Are these double stacks still viable with a lot of these pass catchers getting priced up? I mean, we have Jawan Green at 6,800 now.
Mm-hmm.
Double stacks are definitely getting tough to afford. Chris, what do you think here?
Yeah, I think the DiNucci projections are getting a little high across the industry. We already know Seattle pushes the ball pretty much most of the time. I don't know if it's a massive difference, like I think I mentioned earlier. I definitely still want some DiNucci. I just don't know how much, if I'm going to get like over the field or anything.
Yeah,
I definitely do want to double stack him, but it is going to be hard. You don't even get, if Willis is ruled out, you don't even get like a cheap guy you could throw in to double with him. It's probably going to lead to me having a good amount of VZ. I don't hate getting TJ Hammonds in. They do seem to start to work him in a good bit last week. He's been mostly a pass catching back. Last week he started to get some carries. So I think you can get a little unique with Hammonds in there to do a double stack. Yeah, it's tough.
It is really tough. I mean, I think my DiNucci double stacks are going to have a ton of Jordan VC if we assume Damian Willis sits. I actually think VC is a really great play if Damian Willis sits, because VC, I mean, he gets the air yards, he gets deep targets. They love him in the end zone and in the red zone. I mean, half of their like red zone offense is just jump balls to Josh Gordon and Jordan VC. So I like that quite a bit if Willis sits. I mean, the big issue with VC is that, there are some games where his route share is closer to 50%, and it just makes it hard for him to see value. This week, though, I don't think that'll be an issue if we assume Willis is out. I think among these expensive guys, I like both. I mean, Ja'Cory Pearson is fine. Like, I'll definitely mix him in. But I actually really like both Blake Jackson and Josh Gordon. Projecting pretty similar industry wide, we give a pretty clear edge to Jackson here. Chris, do you have a lean among these three fairly expensive wide receivers?
Jackson I was on last week, and I think I'm on him again. He continues to play the most routes of any of the Seattle guys. He feels like he's the only one that hasn't had like the big blow up game yet.
Yeah,
I don't know when it's going to come. Hopefully this week. He's not, he's cheaper than Gordon. He's cheaper than Pearson. He should probably be the most popular Seattle receiver, and I don't think he will be because I think, salary issues and what, like Jawan Green also looks good, but is only 6,800. Pearson just had the blow up game, but he's way more expensive. Jackson's my favorite. I don't mind Josh Gordon. I don't know how much I'm going to prioritize him. He does get a lot of red zone work. He's just not running all of the routes is the problem.
Yeah. I mean, Blake Jackson, 98% route share these last few weeks. And I do think this is an offense where we can be a little more reliant on route share than some of the other offenses because they're so spread out with the ball that, for these receivers, just getting on the field translates to fantasy points. So I'm kind of with you where I think Blake Jackson probably goes under owned. My guess is he's going to be like 18% and he should probably be closer to like 30. So I like Blake Jackson quite a bit. Really interesting discussion to be had on this backfield, though. I mean, last week I was really banking on, I pretty much only played 3 running backs last week, ended up with like 40 or 45% Phillip Lindsay. I was like, oh, I have great leverage. He's going to be Morgan Ellison 2.0. I'm going to smash. Instead, Phillip Lindsay like barely played. He only had 8 weighted opportunity points, which was 10th among running backs, a 27% snap share, which was 13th among running backs, and an 11% route share, 14th among running backs. And he only got half of backfield weighted opportunity. We saw TJ Hammonds work in quite a bit. I believe set a season high in carries last week. And then we also saw running back tight end hybrid Charlie Temo Peo lead the backfield in snap share. And he got a couple of carries as well. I believe those were like his second and third carries of the season. Philip Lindsay averaging 2.2 yards per carry. That's worse than Darius Bradwell. I think like Lindsay's hope of a bell cow role is pretty much completely cooked. My question for you though is like, can you still mix him into your 4-game slate lineups? I mean, we saw TJ Hammond steal like a inside the 10 carry last week, if I remember correctly, that he ran into the end zone. Hammond's actually looks really good as a runner until he takes any contact and then he just flies backwards. But he's shifty, 6.5 yards per carry for Hammonds. And he's also cheap. Only 3,500. So yeah, Chris, how are you playing this backfield? Is Lindsay viable at all?
I came into this week thinking I would want a lot of Lindsay, but the more I look at it, I don't think so. I think there's too many better options cheaper than him, and for him to pay off his salary and be the most popular of the Seattle guys, probably, like I'd rather play Hammonds. Like 3,500 is so cheap. We just talked about how difficult it's going to be to double stack DiNucci. Like Hammonds is a guy that can really open that up for you.
Yeah, for sure. And I think if you're playing Lindsay, you're not doing it in a DiNucci lineup because he's just, he's not running the routes. Like, I don't think you're going to see many targets there. Right. Hammond's target floor, isn't great, but it is a little better. And he could, get some more traditional reps at wide receiver, especially if Damian Willis is out. So I certainly prefer Hammonds. I think I'm just going to X Philip Lindsay out of my player pool. And if he somehow scores 2 touchdowns, then I'll live with it. But yeah, I mean, I think, Seattle, we know their pass rate is going to be really high. It might be even higher this week, given their incentives. Yeah, Chris, any final thoughts on this backfield before we wrap things up with some playoff handicapping?
I think we're good. Yeah, definitely do try to stack DiNucci though, double stack him because he's expensive and going to be the most popular QB. Like you really do need him to be the best QB by a significant margin. And if that happens, he's going to carry at least 2 guys with him.
Yeah, and because of the way salaries shake out, like I just don't think DiNucci double stacks will be very popular. Which is like probably your best leverage edge here because I mean VC, Juwan Green, Josh Gordon, Blake Jackson, Jacourt Pearson, none of these guys are going to be crazy popular, but they're all going to be on a good amount of rosters. I'd imagine almost every team that's submitted in the $15 this week will probably have a Seattle wide receiver.
Yep.
So double stacking DiNucci, even some of these like kind of awkward, super expensive double stacks that are hard to get to is like a really easy way to gain leverage here because optimizers just aren't going to spit that stuff out.
Yeah, you can do it. We talked to plenty of cheap guys, Brandon Smith, Hammonds, and Houston guys if you have to.
The value at running back too. Yeah. So a lean, a lot of good value. So you can totally fit in these DiNucci double stacks this week. And yeah, I think if you're going to play them on, a third of your teams, you probably want to double stack them on half, maybe more. All right, guys. So wrapping up the show this week, we wanted to talk about some of our best guesses for spreads here for some of these hypothetical playoff matchups. Giving a quick summary of current title odds right now. We've got the DC Defenders. This is on Bovada at plus 140. Houston Roughnecks plus 250. Seattle Sea Dragons plus 500, St. Louis Battlehawks plus 550, Arlington plus 1,400, and the Brahmas are plus 2,500. Chris, do you have any championship bets you like before we handicap some of these potential matchups?
Yeah, one of St. Louis and Seattle is going to be a value. I'm not totally sure which one. I think I have bets on both from earlier in the season at around these odds. One of the only reason that Houston has shorter odds than them is because Houston's locked into the playoffs.
Yep.
If we knew one of Seattle or St. Louis was also locked into the playoffs, they'd be around plus 200 something as well.
Yeah. Plus 250 would be probably my best guess.
Right.
There,
so I would, one of those is definitely a value. Houston is pretty much, I don't think you can bet on it. I'd rather bet on Arlington, but I don't really want to do that. The winner is coming from the North, right? That's the division.
Yes.
Yeah. One of the winners coming from DC, St. Louis, Seattle, and I feel pretty confident about that.
I can't believe this XFL South division
I know.
disrespect. No, yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much in alignment with you. I think DC and Houston are accurately priced. I really like Seattle as a bet this week, and then you can safely hedge with some Vegas plus 8.5 and Vegas money line because
Mhm.
if both teams win, unless St. Louis wins in like a huge blowout and the Seattle game is close, Seattle's going to the playoffs. So, and I think I like Seattle's chances of winning this week a little bit more than St. Louis. So that's probably where I see the value. Also, a little bit of value on Arlington, I think, too.
Mhm.
Arlington against Houston, we can get into, some of these playoff handicapping. This week, obviously, it's a pick 'em, but we don't know if Houston's playing their starters. Chris, next week for the playoffs, if we assume Arlington and Houston, this game would be at Houston. What would you have that spread at?
If Arlington plays well this week, I think it could end up being a pick 'em again next
Ooh,
week. And if it's not, if it's Houston -3, Houston -3.5, I'd probably really like the Arlington side of that. We this Houston offense is just not good anymore, and
yeah,
Perez seems to be giving life to the Arlington offense a decent bit.
yep.
Now, if Perez comes out and is just terrible, which wouldn't shock me either, then maybe my Houston -3 next week makes sense. But yeah, Arlington is long odds solely just because of what we think. Houston being locked in, we think Houston is still good. But yeah, I like next week. I wouldn't be shocked if it's a pick 'em again if they really do play well again this week.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely a little tempted by Arlington. In one sense, just to hedge my Houston futures, but I mean, they looked really good against DC last week. I mean, I think in their semifinal matchup against Houston, I'd probably have Houston -1.5, -2. But that spread's a lot closer than I am personally comfortable with as a Houston fan and championship backer. If San Antonio wins and Arlington loses, though, San Antonio will be in the playoffs. Chris, what do you think the spread would be if it's San Antonio at Houston in round one here?
Probably like minus Houston -4, 4.5 maybe. That
Yeah,
feels about right.
I was thinking 5 or 5.5, somewhere in that range. I think is about right. San Antonio is a team that like I just really wouldn't be worried about at all. As a Houston fan, I think Houston would pretty safely roll San Antonio. I know Neil Orfield is probably not very happy to hear that, but yeah, for Houston's sake, I'd prefer if they got to play San Antonio this week. Arlington seems to be coming into form. So if you're looking for a long shot championship bet, assuming you didn't bankrupt yourself on the Orlando Guardians long shot bet a few weeks ago, I do like
What could
Arlington
have
plus.
been?
Yeah, I know, right? What could have been if they weren't totally inept coaching wise? Dormady didn't turn the ball over 10 times in the last 3 weeks. They'd be in a pretty good spot. On the north side of things, what do you think the spread would be? Or most likely matchup Seattle at DC. What do you think the spread should be there?
I don't think whether it's Seattle or St. Louis that the spread would be too different. It
Oh,
feels
okay.
like it would be DC -3, maybe two and
Really?
a half. Yeah.
So I actually disagree here. I think I'd take DC -3, -2.5 against St. Louis. I think Seattle would be favored in this game, but not by much. Maybe Seattle -1.
I could see
Um,
that.
they
Yeah.
they need to like look decent again this
Yeah.
week, but I mean, man, they've been playing really well. They're first in PFF team grades. I think they would probably be favored on a neutral site against every team in the XFL right
Yeah.
now. They are probably the best team. Um,
That's fair. The books do seem to really buy into their high pass rate stuff as
yeah,
well. So that would not shock me if Seattle was slightly favored or it was a smaller spread for DC if it was Seattle.
Yeah, Seattle's only major weakness is that offensive coordinator June Jones oftentimes only gets plays in with like 10 seconds left on the play clock, and then Ben DiNucci freaks out. That's a lock to happen like twice
I
every game.
know. Yeah.
It's great. I love that they have these guys mic'd up too, because you just hear Ben yelling June, June every play. It's awesome. But all right, Chris, any final thoughts or we wrapped up here?
No, thanks for sticking with us through the regular season. Hopefully you guys have a good week 10 and final 4-game slate.
Yeah, absolutely, guys. This has been the Week 10 edition of the Fantasy Points XFL Breakdown. Thank you so much for tuning in all regular season. And remember, we're going to be back for the playoffs next week at 11:30 a.m. on Friday. But for this week, hope to see all you guys at the top of the leaderboard. Good luck.